This video will be the completion of our series of videos on the third section of the fourth chapter of Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics, the restriction of being and thinking. It's the climax of the whole book in which Heidegger reveals how we got where we are, metaphysically speaking. This is the story of what we might call the Great Fall, the falling away from the originary inception of philosophy, which for Heidegger is a kind of fall from grace, so to speak. In this concluding part of the section, Heidegger will uncover how the ground was laid for the Platonic theory of ideas and the Aristotelian theory of substance, which determined the trajectory that Western metaphysics would take throughout its subsequent history. After the point where we left off last time, Heidegger summarizes his teaching on the interdependent relationship of being and Dasein, or the human being. So on page 194, he writes, "To be human means to gather and apprehend the being of beings, to take over the knowing setting into work of appearance, and thus to steward unconcealment, to preserve it against concealment and covering up." In other words, at the inception of Western metaphysics, and really constituting this inception, being was disclosed as an emerging, a coming to presence and coming to a stand, a constancy. This was a dynamic action, a struggle with becoming and seeming. This emerging, it seems, is inherently evanescent. It is an oscillation, a dynamic pulsation. Along comes a being whose essence it is to gather up this emerging, to go out and meet it and gather it up. This is us, Dasein, the human being. Dasein was disclosed as having a being, or nature or essence, to speak in modern terms, that stood within the overwhelming violence of the emerging of being as Phusis. This essence is actually a multi-part or multi-aspect essential action. It involved gathering and apprehending. Gathering, in a sense, not unrelated to the discerning or taking up that we refer to when we say something like, "I gather that you don't understand me," in everyday life. But of course, at a much deeper level. So gathering that goes along with an apprehending, which is a taking in that goes out to meet what it is to take in, to receive it, and to interrogate it. Also a taking over and stewarding the work of being, the setting into work of appearance, the emerging, or the setting to work, that is the struggle of being to come to presence, to emerge into constancy, and to take a stand. Dasein completes this work. It's the essential work of the human Dasein to take that over, to take it up and to continue it like a helper to being. And then also preserving, that the human's essential task is to preserve what has emerged into unconcealment and been gathered up. And this is something that we do paradigmatically in language. So this is the essence of the human. This is the essence of Dasein. Gathering, apprehending, taking over, stewarding, and preserving the being of beings. This is what was uncovered at the originary inception of Greek philosophy. What Heidegger then is really describing is the essence of the human, the being of the human, as it emerged into clarity at the inception of Western metaphysics with pre-Socratics like Parmenides and Heraclitus. He calls this the inceptive opening up of the essence of the human. The inceptive opening up of the essence of the human. Heidegger also calls this inception decisive. Page 194. It's decisive. It was, remember, a decision, the cutting off from being of a unique essence of the human being. It was also a decision in the sense that it set the trajectory for the next 2.5 millennia of Western history. But this course of Western history was not set in the originary inceptive form. Heidegger outlines an arc of the history of Greek philosophy that might be described as the course of Greek thought from, on the one end, the originary inception, and then on the other hand, the inceptive end. So this represents the story that he's telling, from the originary inception to the inceptive end. And I put this down a little bit lower, not just because my board isn't long enough really to properly fill it out this way, but also because this does represent a kind of falling off, or kind of falling away from the height of greatness of what was originally achieved. But for Heidegger, this is still a very great achievement, even though it doesn't rise to the level of the originary inception. And what this represents is the fall from the pre-Socratics to Plato and Aristotle. So this is what we'll be talking about today, mostly, is how Plato and Aristotle relate to the pre-Socratic thinkers that we have been talking about mostly so far. With Plato and Aristotle, the inceptive opening up of the essence of the human was lost. It failed to be preserved. So there was this opening of the essence of the human, or Dasein, that belonged to the originary inception that we no longer find here. It failed to be preserved. To say that this was a misfortune would be the grossest possible understatement. Clearly for Heidegger, this was a catastrophe, because it entailed the profoundest sort of self-forgetfulness and alienation, and because it entailed a forgetting of being itself. But, caveat, later on we'll see that this might actually have been inevitable and isn't without its own sort of silver lining, but more on that later. Our belonging to the being of beings and the being of Dasein itself go together. To withhold our openness to being is, in a sense, to destroy our humanity. Heidegger writes on page 197, near the top, "But for Dasein, withholding such openness toward being means nothing other than giving up its own essence. This demands that it either step out of being or else never step into Dasein. This is expressed once again in Sophocles in a choral ode of the tragedy Oedipus at Colonus. The Greek there, skip over that. Never to have stepped into Dasein triumphs over the gatheredness of beings as a whole. Never to have stepped into Dasein triumphs over the gatheredness of beings as a whole." And this is often translated, as it says in the footnote there, "Not to be born surpasses all speech." Not to be born surpasses all speech. A common attitude in tragedy, it may have been better never to have been born. But what Heidegger takes from this is not the kind of pessimistic conclusion, but the idea that if we don't step into being, we also do not step into our Dasein, into our existence. That there's a sense in which this openness to being is what constitutes us for the first time as fully human. It's as if we have a mission assigned to us by being. This is too anthropomorphic, but for the lack of a better image right now, if we fail to assume this mission that we've been assigned by being to gather, to steward, to preserve, we fail to exist as fully human. Heidegger seems to see the entire history of the West as a kind of avoidance of the human. Very quickly after its inception, Western philosophy fell into a state of self-oblivion. Heidegger also provides a helpful way to summarize the difference between the inception and the end. On page 195, he says on the top, in order to show the distance between this definition, that is the definition of the human being he's referring to here as a rational living being, in order to show the distance between the definition of a human being as the rational living being and the inceptive opening up of the essence of being human, that is, in order to show the difference between this view and this, we can contrast the inception and the end in a formulaic way. The end is evident in the formula anthropos equals zoon ekon. So this is down here with Plato and Aristotle. Anthropos equals zoon logon ekon. The human being is the living thing. That's the way Heidegger translates this. The human being is the living thing. So this is basically what's traditionally translated as man is the rational animal. But then more literally, we might translate as man is the animal who speaks the word. Or even more literally, that man is the animal who sounds the logos, or says or sounds the logos. So who gives sound to the logos. So here's one understanding of the essence of the human, the one that we find at the inceptive end of the arc from the origination of Greek philosophy to its culmination, or the end of its falling off. Namely, man is the rational animal, man is the animal who speaks the word, or man is the animal who sounds the logos. And that's what this logon, zoon, logon, ekon. And in contrast to this, Heidegger says, we grasp the inception in a freely constructed formula that also summarizes our interpretation up to now. Freely constructed meaning Heidegger is making this up himself, right? And he says, in contrast to this understanding of the essence of the human, in the interpretation we've been developing up to now, what we've seen as the essence of the human is this. Phusis equals logos, anthropon, ekon. Now this sounds like, saying the word speaks man. Would be kind of a flat-footed translation, but of course we know better than this. The Heidegger doesn't mean that, and at any rate, this sounds either nonsensical or a kind of poetic form of indirect speech. Rather, what Heidegger means here is the gathering, namely the gathering of being, has an echo or sounds. Has an echo in, or I'll put sounds out in man. The gathering, and of course we understand here the gathering of being, has an echo or sounds out in man. And this is not nonsense. It announces the way in which we are dependent upon being for our essence, our raison d'etre. Man is the being whose task it is to gather, to steward, and to preserve being, which sounds, or we might say resounds, again in his words. Sounds for the first time, and then as it's preserved as resounds in his words. And think of here, of course, this word ekon, we see here the word echo, the Greek mythological character, the nymph, from whose tragic story we get this idea of the echo, of a resounding repetition of the last word spoken. And that is sort of what man is for Heidegger, the repetition of the speaking of being, when man is reaching the heights of his most originary essence. Because man is the being whose task it is to gather and steward and preserve being, and being therefore resounds, is heard again in his words, or is perhaps heard for the first time originally in the original experience, but is heard again in the preservation. This formulation indicates a being who is sent by being for a unique mission, to preserve and shelter being from what? From concealment. This being gets its essence and nature from this task. Whereas in the Aristotelian formula, man is an animal, just one present at hand being, like this pen or this water, this body. I'm just an animal, my animal body, one present among others. And this is very different from the way Heidegger understands the originary Inception's conception of the essence of the human. In Heidegger's formula, the reversal, placing logos in the subject position rather than merely as an instrument or a piece of equipment for man, is meant to capture the sense of the Greek conception in which man is uniquely bound up with the being of beings itself. You might say that our raison d'etre is être. Apologies to any French listeners I may have. But our reason for being is being. The being of beings is not something present at hand, but it's a happening. It's an event. It's the event of unconcealment, emerging, coming to presence. And we exist for the sake of reception, almost a kind of pious reception of this. Man, even though, of course, this is all bound up with this sort of violent interaction with the overwhelming that necessarily defeats us, even as we attempt to gather it. But in any event, man derives his essence from his participation in that event of the emergence of being into unconcealment as the gatherer, steward, and preserver of it. So Heidegger says, being human is grounded in the opening up of the being of beings. And recall again that the key word for being at the inception, which doesn't appear in this formula, is phusis, the emerging, abiding sway. And the key word for Dasein, or its key essence, is captured in the word logos, or the gathering of being. Heidegger's great emphasis in his account of pre-Socratic thought has been the belonging together of phusis and logos, so understood. That's the main theme, if you will, subject matter of this chapter's section on being and thinking. However, this belonging together of phusis and logos has always been a unity in struggle. Heidegger's view, often stated, is that two combatants struggle to belong to each other, and in their struggle, they do belong to each other. They need each other. Perhaps their existence is not dependent upon their relation, but their essence is. They wouldn't be essentially who they are without each other. Still, they are separate, and there's always a risk of becoming permanently separate, of going out of balance. And this is essentially what happened with phusis and logos, a kind of disjoining of the struggle that we see in the originary Inception, and instead a separation and the unbalancing of their originary relation. And what happened instead is logos comes to dominate phusis. And this relation has many names. Logos coming to dominate phusis, reason coming to dominate nature, rationalism, and we'll talk about this transformation in the remainder of this video. So how does logos come to dominate phusis? Logos does this, comes to dominate phusis, by reinterpreting itself as reason and making itself into a court of justice, aka the court of reason, a judgment seat over being. A famous example of this that's criticized by Friedrich Nietzsche, and that Heidegger follows Nietzsche in this on page 198, is the pessimistic judgment of Schopenhauer, who from the court of reason is passing judgment on existence. Life is a business that doesn't cover its costs. Life is no good. That was Schopenhauer's judgment. And Nietzsche criticized this, saying that we lack really the standing to issue this judgment. And Heidegger certainly would endorse that view. But this has not stopped the human design from being determined, at least in the West, by this sort of arrogation of reason to the position of being judge over being, and sometimes jury and executioner as well. Of course, this breakdown of relation between Phusis and Logos would not be possible unless it were somehow prepared for and inherent in the relation itself originally. Beginning on around page 200 in our text, Heidegger lays out the climactic conclusions of his analysis of the inception of Western metaphysics, from its originary inception in the pre-Socratics to its inceptive end in Plato and Aristotle. And the question that must be answered as we trace this downward trajectory, this decline from this position to this, is how did Logos, or thinking, separate itself off from and set itself up as taking precedence over Phusis, or being? Once again, the key question that Heidegger will be investigating as he traces this story of the decline of Greek philosophy from the originary inception to the inceptive end is, how did Logos, thinking, separate itself off from and set itself up as taking precedence over Phusis, being? And there are two parts of this question here, as Heidegger notes on page 200. How does the relation between Phusis and Logos look at the end of Greek philosophy in Plato and Aristotle? How is Phusis understood here? What form and role has Logos taken on? So basically, Heidegger is setting himself the project of giving a thumbnail interpretation of Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysics. That will give us the answer to the question of how the relation between Phusis and Logos looks at the end of Western metaphysics. And then second, how did this end come about? What's the real basis of the change? And you can glean from this that, as I said already in anticipation of this, there's going to be a kind of internal tension within the originary inception itself that accounts for this change. It wasn't just a matter of the temperamental predilections of Plato and Aristotle, nor of their unique genius, nor of their, neuroses, someone with a more Nietzschean or Freudian bent of mind might be inclined to use to explain this. Rather, it belongs to the internal structure of this original opening up of being itself, that the end of the story sort of arrived as a kind of a natural outgrowth of the beginning. All right, let's summarize this. And a lot of this is covered actually on page 211, so you can look there. Well, but at the end of Greek philosophy, just to give kind of the summary account, experiencing mild technical difficulties here. My pen. So, first and most importantly, Phusis becomes idea. Hopefully you can still read that. Phusis becomes idea. Truth becomes correctness. truth becomes correctness. Logos becomes the assertion. Logos becomes assertion. Assertion becomes truth as correctness. Assertion becomes truth as correctness. The basis of assertion is the object, what later became known as the object, although it will have a different Greek name and also intermediary Latin names before it becomes known as the object. And then finally, the possibilities of being are determined by categories whose origin is the logical forms of assertion. So the possibilities of being possibilities of being are the categories, and the categories themselves come from the logic of assertion, or the logical forms of assertion. So this is how things look at the inceptive end of metaphysics. Phusis, and of course we've been talking a lot in preceding videos about the sense of this, as well as in this video, this becomes idea. Idea. Truth, we talked a lot about truth as aletheia, unconcealment, this becomes correctness. Logos, the gathering in that's related to apprehending, this becomes assertion. And then assertion itself develops its own character, namely, it becomes the locus of truth as correctness. So that relates these two things. And then at the basis of assertion is the object. The object. Being becomes, you might say, objective. And the possibilities of being are determined by logical forms of assertion, which give us the categories, the logical forms of assertion there. Okay, so that's the picture. This is Platonic Aristotelian philosophy, right here. This is the Platonic Aristotelian philosophy. So, how did this come about? What accounts for this? First of all, at the end of the inception of metaphysics, the Greek word eidos, that's of course the word that gets translated as idea. Eidos becomes idea. This becomes the prevailing word for being. The first thing that Heidegger notes is that from a modern perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense to equate being with idea. Matter maybe, but idea? We're used to the idea that being is, stuff, material. But the idea that being would be idea doesn't make a lot of sense from our modern perspective. However, if we approach this metaphysical view from the perspective of the inception, it begins to make more sense. Eidos, the idea, refers to the visible, or to the view that something offers, or the look of a being. We've talked about this before, but on page 201, Heidegger says, the word idea means what is seen in the visible, the view that something offers. What is offered is the current look or eidos of whatever we encounter. The look of a thing is that within which, as we say, it presents itself to us, represents itself, and as such stands before us. The look is that within which and as which the thing comes to presence, that is, in the Greek sense, is. This standing is the constancy of what has come forth from itself, the constancy of Phusis. But this standing here of the constant is also, from the human point of view, the foreground of what comes to presence from itself, the apprehensible. The look is that in which and as which the thing comes to presence. Once we accept that and the Inception's originary view that being is emerging into presence, it's not a great leap to equate being with the idea. Heidegger goes on to note that the idea stands there in its whatness and howness. It's, in other words, in the answers to the questions what and how. What is it? How is it? The idea stands there in its whatness and howness. The whatness and the howness of the idea are the origin of the later notions of existence and essence. On top of page 202, the idea, the look, as coming to presence, then coming to presence shows itself as constancy in a double sense. On the one hand, the look entails the standing forth from unconcealment, the simple estin, the simple is. On the other hand, what shows itself in the look is that which looks that way. What stands there? The T estin, the what it is. In other words, the look is the standing forth from unconcealment, which becomes the existence of the thing. The look also refers to what shows itself as what stands there, which becomes the essence of the thing, which shows itself as what stands there. If idea is both the existence or essence of a thing, then it's easy to see how it could be considered the being of beings. This transformation of Phusis into eidos, being into idea, came to seem natural for centuries. And even from our contemporary perspective, it's often thought that Plato's transformation of the thought of Heraclitus and Parmenides around the idea of Phusis into the idea of idea, then the interpretation of nature in terms of this rational construct of idea represented a kind of progress. And so Heidegger gives voice to the objection that Plato's metaphysics, far from being a falling away, is actually the fulfillment of the Inception. Bottom of 202, he says, is tradition not completely in the right? If for centuries it has seen this Greek philosophy in light of Platonic philosophy, the interpretation of being as idea in Plato is so little a departure, much less a downfall from the Inception, that instead it grasps this Inception in a more unfolded and sharper way, and grounds it through the theory of ideas, in quotes, the theory of ideas. Plato is the fulfillment of the Inception. This is, of course, is not Heidegger's own view, but he's giving voice to a particular type of attitude or objection, which is the self-image of those advocates of what is often styled itself as classical philosophy. Classical philosophy. Or sometimes perennial philosophy. You'll hear that phrase as well. This is the perennial philosophy. Plato, Aristotle. Sometimes in the Catholic tradition, they'll tack, the great scholastics, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas onto that as well. St. Augustine, throw him in there. That's the classical philosophy, the perennial philosophy, right? And from this point of view, Plato merely brought to clarity and rigor what was discovered by Parmenides and Heraclitus in a kind of crude and obscure and poetic literary way. From Heidegger's perspective, the problem is not with drawing out eidos as a necessary consequence of Phusis. That does indeed follow from the notion of being. It does indeed follow from it. Being is that which shines forth from unconcealment. And anything that shines forth from unconcealment will have a certain look. That's not a problem. It's not a problem in deriving the idea as a kind of consequence of being. The problem is Plato's move of making this look the basis of being, rather than merely being a necessary consequence of it. Heidegger sees Plato as guilty of a conflation of two senses of appearing, one of which belongs properly to Phusis, and one of which belongs properly to eidos. Now, Phusis is properly the self-gathering event that brings itself to a stand and thus stands there in gatheredness. That's one sense of appearing. To appear is to gather yourself and bring yourself to a stand in your gatheredness. That is to appear. Eidos is properly the foreground, the surface, or the look of something that's already standing there. And of course, we have this sense of appear, two senses of appear that more or less correspond to what Heidegger is getting at here. We might say, for example, Brittany is appearing at the Taj Mahal or Caesar's Palace. I don't even know if these places even exist anymore, but we'll say that. And I'm not saying which Brittany I'm referring to. But Brittany is appearing at the Taj Mahal in Las Vegas, let's say. Okay? That's the first sense. Gathering yourself and bringing yourself to a stand in your gatheredness. Gather yourself together, Brittany, so you can get out there on stage. Get yourself together. Right? Gathering yourself together to bring yourself to a stand. Get yourself together so you can go stand out there on stage. That's the sense that belongs to Phusis, of appearing. Whereas eidos is the foreground surface or look of something. Right? So when people in the audience are saying, gosh, Brittany is looking pretty ragged. She looks pretty ragged today. I wonder if she's, feeling all right. That's the foreground surface or look of something. That's how does she appear? How does she appear? It's not that she's appearing. If she wasn't already appearing on the stage, you wouldn't be able to talk about the foreground surface or look of how she appears. Right? So what Heidegger is saying is that Phusis concerns this first sense of appearance, whereas eidos refers to the second sense of appearance. Phusis is the gathering of yourself to bring yourself to a stand in your gatheredness. Eidos is the foreground or surface of something that is already standing there. And of course, every Phusis is going to have this sort of eidos in this sense. It's going to have some way or other that it appears on its surface. But nonetheless, these are different senses of appearing. So we can see the difference in the metaphysical level between these two senses of appearing. And Heidegger says that we see this particularly if we look at them in relation to the space in which the appearing transpires. So on 203 and 204, he says, considered in terms of the essence of space, the difference between the two types of appearing is this. Appearing in the first and authentic sense, as the gathered bringing itself to stand, takes space in. It first conquers space. As standing there, it creates space for itself. It brings about everything that belongs to it. Well, it itself is not imitated. I think there's still a related sense of this. Again, if we go with the performance analogy of someone who comes to dominate the room, right? This person has such a presence, has a commanding presence, that space becomes organized around them in a kind of existential sense. That's the first sense of appearance. Appearing in the second sense merely steps forth from an already prepared space, and it is viewed by looking at within the already fixed dimension of this space. So again, the good example, the stage is an already prepared space, and out comes the performer. The performer's looking a little ragged, right? But that raggedness already presupposes that a space has been cleared. In other cases, it's the appearing itself that creates the space. And this is particularly clear, I would think, if you think of not a stage set performance, but let's say an impromptu performance. Someone who, starts singing at a party and all of a sudden commands the attention of people around and becomes the center of attention, creating that space. So there's two different metaphysical levels here. The first type of appearing creates the space in which the appearing takes place. It rips open space, Heidegger allows himself to say. Whereas the second is just a kind of parasitic sense, metaphysically derivative on this more fundamental act of appearing. It merely fills a pre-existing space. Plato's fundamental error for Heidegger is conflating these two senses of appearing and arrogating the idea which appears, and indeed does truly appear, but only in the second sense, in the secondary sense. Heidegger sees Plato as arrogating the idea into the first sense of appearance, arrogating it to the rank of an appearance in this primary sense of gathering. Appearing, therefore, becomes ambiguous in Plato as it pertains to being. And likewise, the notion of essence becomes ambiguous. Essence becomes ambiguous as well as appearing. That's the characteristic of Platonism. Appearance and essence both become ambiguous. The idea in constituting the look of a thing provides the what of a thing, what it is. The what a thing is comes from the look of the thing. And Heidegger notes that in order for this to be true, we have to presuppose that by look, we're now talking about not just what speaks to our sense of sight, but to all of our perceptions generally. This broadened sense of the look. That also we have this relation between literal sight and something like insight, right? Which is like we have other forms of perception that use sight as kind of a metaphorical way of expressing them. So the look of a thing in this broad sense provides the what of the thing, provides the what it is. And the notion of course, the what it is the essence. This is very familiar to us from discussions of Aristotle and the scholastics and Heidegger as well. In fact, probably Spinoza too. However, in Platonism, the idea also constitutes the that it is of a thing. It's standing out or constancy, which is not the case in the originary Inception, but is the case in Platonism. That the idea gives us not only the what it is of the thing, its look, or its appearance in the second sense, but also the appearance in the first sense, the that it is of the thing, the standing out. And thus the line between being and essence becomes blurred, just as the line between emerging into appearance and putting forth a kind of look becomes blurred. In Plato, whatness becomes what really is. Whatness becomes what really is. Consequently, beings themselves are demoted to the status of meon. That's in this word, which is something like participatory being. You could translate that here in this context, in Plato's technical sense. Participatory being, that is, beings, this book, this pen, are participatory beings. My body, they're not fully beings in themselves for Plato. On Platonism, these things are beings only insofar as they participate. They're seen as something like accompaniments or ornaments to whatness, which is the only true being. The idea becomes the paradigma, the paradigm or the model. Particular beings are views considered as attempts to imitate this model. Particular being is understood in terms of mimesis, imitation or representation or copying. And I will assume this is broadly familiar to viewers. In their attempts as imitations, particular beings fall short of this model. The model that is the whatness, that is the idea. And so they're not fully beings. This gives rise to a cleft. We talked about this earlier, the charismos or cleft, the gap, think about a cleft between two parts of a mountain or mountain peaks into which one can fall as into an abyss. This cleft or gap between, on the one hand, particular beings and being proper. Particular beings and being proper. On the one hand, you have being proper, which is the idea. On the other hand, you have particular beings. And between the two is this wide cleft. This gives rise, this cleft between particular beings and being proper, between the idea and ordinary things that participate in the idea or the form, right? Another word for that. It gives rise to another sense of appearance, the sense in which appearance, phenomenon in Greek, is opposed to and set off over and against an underlying reality or on. Again, in this sense, on, being. So you have the phenomenon, the appearance, and the on, the reality. And with Platonism, then we get for the first time the traditional or classical, you might say, sense of appearance-reality distinction. An appearance-reality distinction. Because you have these particular beings that all fall short of the perfect paradigm, the prototypical or archetypal whatness that is contained in the idea. And so they are not fully in being, they're not really beings at all, and so they fall on one side of this cleft between being and merely participatory beings. Once the idea is seen as the archetype and the prototype of all being, then the opening up of being, and our name for the opening up of being is, of course, unconcealedness, aletheia, disclosedness, truth. The opening up of being becomes directed towards correct representation, correct mimesis, or imitation. And this becomes an increasingly central notion in Western thought, mimesis, imitation, or representation. The opening up of being becomes then associated with mimesis, correct representation, similitude to the idea. Page 206, he writes, because the idea is what really is, and the idea is the prototype, all opening up of beings, must be directed towards equaling the prototype, resembling the archetype, directing itself according to the idea. The truth of Phusis, aletheia as the unconcealment that essentially unfolds in the emerging sway, now becomes homeosis and mimesis, resemblance, directedness, the correctness of seeing, the correctness of apprehending as representing. We get the beginnings of the idea of truth as correct representation. This is the origin of the notion of truth as correctness. Truth as correctness. Aletheia, or unconcealment of being, is interpreted solely in terms of correct mimesis of an archetype or a prototypal idea. So, as Phusis, being becomes idea, truth becomes correctness. Notice how this conception of truth as correct representation, which still dominates today in various forms, originally gets all of its sense from the presumption that being is an idea, a look, an appearance that has the character of whatness, and that particular beings get their being such as it is, which is always a kind of deficient mode of being, but they get their beings only by virtue of being representations of this what. And the whatness is given in the idea. Once you buy into this metaphysical picture, it will seem inevitable that being can only be revealed by the correct imitation or representation. The correct imitation or representation within a given being of the whatness of the idea. So this leads to the first discussion question. How do you understand the difference between the perspective on being and truth found in figures like Parmenides and Heraclitus, and the perspective on being and truth found in Plato, as described by Heidegger? Does Platonic metaphysics actually represent a needed clarification and sharpening up of the notions of Phusis and aletheia, as has traditionally been presupposed? Or, as Heidegger argues, does it represent a degeneration of the inception of Greek philosophy? What are the comparative strengths and weaknesses of the pre-Socratic and the Platonic views of being and truth? So once again, first discussion question, how do you understand the difference between the perspective on being and truth found in figures like Parmenides and Heraclitus and that found in Plato, as described by Heidegger? Does Platonic metaphysics represent a needed clarification and sharpening up of the notions of Phusis and aletheia? That's the traditional presupposition. Or is Heidegger right that it represents a degeneration of the inception of Greek philosophy? What are the comparative strengths and weaknesses of the pre-Platonic and Platonic views of being and truth? This Platonic reinterpretation of being and truth would inevitably have consequences for how logic and the human being were conceived too. Logos becomes the assertion. Logos becomes the assertion. And the assertion becomes the locus of truth as correctness. So those are the next two stages in the development here. Logos becomes assertion, and assertion becomes the locus of truth as correctness. I see there that I should add something there. Assertion isn't truth as correctness, because of course you can have false or incorrect assertions. Hopefully you got that. But it will become the locus of truth as correctness. I was a little bit distracted earlier by the momentary failure of my pen, but I left that out. But assertion is the locus of truth as correctness. Logos is the assertion. Now, language has the inherent properties of being able to preserve and pass on what is opened up in an emergent of being, in a happening of truth. It's able to preserve it and pass it on. It's not just a happening that happens and then it's forgotten. We can develop linguistic vehicles that preserve it. But this property has a downside. The original experience that has been preserved in language does not have to be re-experienced. I think for us this is clearest in the case of most poetry, where oftentimes you can read a poem and understand the meanings of the individual words, but the experience that evidently the poet had that led him or her to write the poem is something that's lost on you. That's one example of this. This lack of presence of words, but absence of the experience that the words were meant to gather. Heidegger describes this as a loosening of truth from beings, page 207. There's a danger of truth degenerating into mere hearsay. Think of the example of hearsay in a court of law. I didn't experience it myself, but I heard so-and-so tell me this. Right? And this is the origin of conventional wisdom. They say, the things that people believe just because they said it. It's hearsay. And this is the degeneration, of course, of the metaphysical function of language. In the Inception, logos was closely tied to the happening of unconcealment itself. It was the very gathering in the service of unconcealment. However, once the Platonic interpretation of being comes to dominate, unconcealment is restricted to correct representation, similitude in mimesis. This reduces the logos, which formerly was the gathering up of the overwhelming sway of being, it reduces it to just the site of representation, the site of representation, the site of the representation of the idea. And that is the assertion. The assertion. Logos just becomes the assertion. One of the many meanings of logos that we become familiar with. Assertion here, though, for Heidegger translates a Greek word phosis, a word for displaying itself, showing or demonstrating through saying. Now, at this point in the exposition, although Platonism serves as the foundation for Heidegger of the assertion as the locus of truth, at this point he begins to turn his attention primarily towards Aristotle, whose logical writings are what he now has in view, or what came to be known as his logical writings. The assertion in the Platonic view could be seen as a kind of picture or locus of mimesis, whose standard is the idea. Truth as correctness is no longer a happening or an event of the disclosure of being, but it's a mere property, namely a property of assertions. Assertions are words or sayings, but not just any sayings. They are saying something about something. Legein ti kata tainos, saying something about something. Thus, there must be a something. There must be a something if there is to be a saying something about something. There must be a something that the assertion is about. And that's a this lying there. This lying there is what the assertion is about. So assertion presupposes something that is about it, or that it is about rather, and that is what came to be known as the object. Originally, in Greek, it was the this lying there, or the hupokaimenon. This would then become known as the subject, the subjectum in Latin, the subject, and then later as the object. We can still think of this as the subject matter of the assertion. But now we would tend to say it's the object that the assertion is asserting something about. Right? So that's this sense. But this had to go through its own transformation in the history of Western thought. What's this object of the assertion? This is essentially where Aristotelian metaphysics starts. Aristotle proceeded in his philosophical investigations by observing the various things that could be asserted about an object. And these various things that could be asserted about an object became known as the categories. That's essentially what categories mean, various things that can be asserted about an object. So, for example, being in a state, being large, being related, etc., the various categories of things that can be asserted. These categories are derived from the various forms of assertion because they represent various things that can be asserted of an object. So thus the categories become the theory of being, as we see in Aristotle, but they're based upon logos understood as assertion. Categories are what can be asserted of beings. They are the logical forms in which things can be asserted of beings. Logos as assertion, demonstration, Phusis in Greek, becomes in Aristotle the standard of being. It becomes so much the standard of being that an antiphosis or a contradiction is regarded as impossible, a contrary demonstration. The contradictory cannot be. Non-contradiction thus becomes the bare minimum criterion of being. On the Platonic Aristotelian interpretation, logos ceases to be the dynamic gathering that belongs to Dasein, and instead it's just another present-at-hand thing. Logos is just an assertion, just another handy tool to use. It becomes the organon of knowledge, the organon or tool, the tool for securing truth against mere opinions or doxa that distort or twist the truth. Truth as correctness is, from its Platonic source, determined to be focused on accurate representation. And this means just avoidance of false representations, avoidance of distortions, twistings of the straightforward imitation. Heidegger elaborates on this on page 214 in our text. The opposition of being and seeming now becomes the opposition of logically correct judgments to judgments that are logically incorrect, or twistings of the correct representation of an object. So remember, in the originary Inception, there's this internal interrelationship between being and seeming, insofar as being is essentially a matter of coming to appearance, and coming to appearance has this sort of internal relationship with seeming, which is also a shining forth. All that is gone once you get to Aristotle. Now, the opposition between being and seeming is just a matter of the opposition between judgments that are correct representations and judgments that are not correct representations. judgments that are logically correct and judgments that are logically incorrect. When truth is conceived in this way, notice something. The focus is on beings, and not on being. We're not concerned any longer with the being of this glass of water, but rather we're concerned with what sorts of assertions can be made or judgments can be made about this that will accurately represent what is true in the object. And being then gets left out of the picture. The disclosedness of being, which is the condition that makes all these assertions possible in the first place, this falls out of philosophy's concern in favor of a one-sided, from Heidegger's perspective, concern with securing the avoidance of the false. It's in this philosophical context that substance comes to dominate Western metaphysics. It becomes the main word for being of beings, substance. Aristotle's word that will be translated as substance is ousia. We discussed this before, at least briefly, in our discussion of Aristotle, ousia. And this word originally meant literally, according to Heidegger, citing Socrates, it originally meant literally present at hand possessions, one's property. Ousia is one's property, even one's estate. One's ousia is one's property, one's estate, the stuff that one goes to an estate planner to have put into a trust for your kids when you start getting up there in age. I don't know if the ancient Greeks had estate planners, but if they did, they would have been concerned with ousia, according to Heidegger's reading of its original sense. Right? Ousia refers to your things. It's my things. My vintage car collection, or my vintage chariot collection, or whatever it might be. That seems like an odd candidate to become the keynote term for civilization's metaphysics. But we can ask the question, why did Aristotle take over this word as his word for the being of beings? According to Heidegger, this is the top of 215, ousia means being in the sense of constant presence. Presence at hand. Consequently, what really is what always is. What is continually present is what we must go back to in advance in all comprehending and producing of anything. The model, the idea. What is continually present is what we must go back to in all logos, asserting. In all asserting, we must go back to what is continually present, as what already lies at hand. The hypokaimenon, the subjectum, the object is ousia. The object of the assertion is ousia. What always already lies at hand before us from the point of view of Phusis, of emergence, what is proteron, the earlier, the a priori. This is the idea of an objective world that, as it were, exists present at hand prior to any of our assertions about it. And we have to conform our assertions to the object. Because of the concern mentioned earlier with the avoidance of the false, the avoidance of the incorrect, of the pseudo-reality, the standard of being becomes what is always constantly present and that is present prior. Ousia had a pre-existing meaning as what is constantly there and also what is prior in a sense, especially if you think of it in terms of the estate or what you inherited, the estate that your family inherited. This is very aristocratic philosophy. Like, the family estate that had its long-standing presence in the family, that was always already there. It also connotes what one has surety of, what is guaranteed to one, right? You are the rightful heir of your estate. That's ousia. So Aristotle extended the meaning of this word metaphorically to become a word for the being of beings. Doxa, views and opinions, are inconstant. They fluctuate and vary from city to city, from polis to polis, from age to age, from person to person, even from day to day within a single person. Your views and opinions change. The opposing standard to doxa, view and opinions, is truth. And this must be, as opposed to these doxa, these views and opinions, what does not vary, what does not fluctuate, what does not go away. Namely, the constantly present, the assured, the guaranteed, ousia, substance. With thinking keyed in this way to the constantly standing object, the way is now paved for the dominance of reason over being in the familiar rationalistic sense. This dominance is finally cemented with the rise of mathematical modes of thinking as the privileged manner of grounding true assertions. Interestingly, for Heidegger, this starts with Christianity. With the advent of Christian thought, being gets reinterpreted as being created. With Christianity, being, to be, is to be created. Since God was conceived as a rational being, it was concluded that his creation also had to be rationally structured. And then when the creation, when the relation of the creator to the creature is dissolved, as Heidegger says, apparently he's referring here to the rise of modern secularism, man steps into the place of God. And mathematics is assumed to be the rational structure of reality. Since reality is still assumed to be rational, and mathematics is the paradigm of what man can understand of rational structure. Mathematics also embodies the enduring, the constant. It's capable of representing the constant structures of reality and thus capable of the most certain truth. It's capable of undergirding the correct assertions. This mathematization of being causes a reinterpretation of becoming as well. Becoming becomes, in Descartes, the mathematically determinable change of place. Shifting of place along the Cartesian coordinate grid, that's becoming. That's what becoming is. So the opposition of being and becoming in modern rationalism becomes just an opposition between what stays put, that's being, and what cannot stay in one place, that's becoming. What changes or becomes is what's subject to local motion, to constant change of place, and that's what becoming is. Being is what stays put. This transformation of the meaning of being and becoming then lays the groundwork for the rationalistic, materialistic, physicalistic, naturalistic views of being that dominate the modern world. And that basically completes the story of how we get from the originary inception of metaphysics in Parmenides and Heraclitus and the conception of the essence of human Dasein and of being that went along with it to our modern rationalistic, physicalistic, materialistic outlook on the world. But the crucial turn is in the end of the inception, as Heidegger calls it, with Plato and Aristotle. Second discussion question. Does Heidegger give a fair account of the mode of rationalism that has come to dominate Western thought? How has it come to dominate it, in your view? If not, if Heidegger hasn't given a fair account of the mode of rationalism that has come to dominate Western thought, what in his picture seems to be inaccurate to you? If he has given an accurate picture, what is gained and what is lost by this dominance of the West by rationalism? What do you think Heidegger would say about the various marginalized or underground strains of irrationalism that have cropped up in Western history? For example, various forms of the occult. Is Heidegger siding with irrationalism against rationalism? Is that, for example, why he writes so obscurely? So once again, second discussion question. Does Heidegger give a fair account of the mode of rationalism that has come to dominate Western thought and how it has come to dominate it? If not, what in his picture seems inaccurate to you? If so, what is gained and what is lost by this dominance of the West by rationalism? What do you think Heidegger would say about the various marginalized or underground strains of irrationalism that have cropped up in Western history? For example, the occult. Is Heidegger siding with irrationalism against rationalism? Is that why he writes so obscurely? To sum up, the inceptive end is what we find in Plato and Aristotle, not the originary inception of Greek philosophy, and it is this end that has determined the history of Western philosophy. The originary inception was forgotten, and later developments were read back into the pre-Socratic texts, resulting in a distorted understanding that obscured what was unconcealed there. For Heidegger, Phusis and Logos come apart, not because of some external imposition from the outside, as it were. They come apart because of the internally driven transformation of unconcealment into correctness. The problem was that the Greek mind, which had apprehended the essence of truth as unconcealment, could not preserve this apprehension. As a result, the originary inception collapsed. This apprehension, however, is the key to understanding the relationship between being and thinking. In the wake of the collapse of the understanding of the essence of truth, philosophy has struggled in vain to explain the relationship between assertion and being. The question, how does language hook up to reality, still remains the unsolvable question of the theory of reference in analytic philosophy of language, for example, in metaphysics. Being and thinking have been irremediably sundered ever since Plato. Irremediably sundered. I was proud of that when I wrote this, but I should have checked to make sure I could pronounce it first. But the point is worth emphasizing a few points and stumbling over a few words. Being and thinking have been irremediably sundered ever since Plato. There is no remedy. Or there is one, but not within the context of Western metaphysics, which is footnotes to Plato. Western thought has been, as a result, captured by a host of insuperable dualisms. For Heidegger, this will continue to be the case until the question of being is, quote, brought back to its adequate ground and basis. Brought back to its adequate ground and basis. So Heidegger calls for a retrieval of the origination of Western metaphysics. In a way, its collapse was inevitable and only for the sake of us, so that we could retrieve it. Page 213, he says, the ground of the collapse lies first in the greatness of the inception and in the essence of the inception itself. The inception, as incipient, must, in a certain way, leave itself behind. The inception that initiates can never directly preserve its initiating. It can never preserve it in the only way that it can be preserved, namely by retrieving it more originally in its originality. By retrieving it more originally in its originality. Therefore, we can address the inception and the collapse of truth solely in a thoughtful retrieval. The urgency of being and the greatness of its inception are not merely an object for historians to observe, explain, and evaluate. This does not preclude, but instead demands the possibility that this collapse be displayed as far as possible in its historical course. In other words, Parmenides and Heraclitus did not have the perspective that we have to see what it was that they originally uncovered. Thus, our retrieval of their philosophy, if we engage in a project of trying to retrieve it in its originality, has the capacity, potentially, to go farther than they did in the unconcealment of being. But this would presuppose engaging in a certain kind of historical project and recovery that doesn't just detach itself from the philosophy that's going on in these early texts, but that participates in it, and participates most importantly in the originary experiences that gave rise to the philosophy.